I believe that over the past month, I might have just uncovered the true history of the One Piece world, and the answer to it all lies in these two calendars. Because they may hold the true story of how the sun god Nika betrayed his own kin and brought chaos to the entire One Piece world. These calendars may even unravel the tale of how heaven and earth ultimately clashed, leaving the ancient One Piece world covered in a seemingly endless ocean. And I even believe that they may hold the answer to what happened to the Lunarian race, the sun god Nika, and really the entire ancient One Piece world before the Void Century. If this is your first time on the channel, welcome. I've been researching this for months now and have been uploading a mega theory all about the ancient history of the One Piece world. Today's gonna be part 3 of the 4 ages of One Piece mega theory, so if you haven't seen parts 1 and 2, I do recommend that you will check them out later, but let me briefly catch you up to speed here. This next to me is what I call the 4-age model of One Piece, and last time we covered the second age, the Age of Nika. Now, in a nutshell, I propose the idea that 4 incredibly powerful Lunarians, the gods of Earth, Forest, Rain, and Sun, ended up coming down and conquering the One Piece planet, taught its citizens farming, built civilizations, but for a more nefarious purpose than they originally thought. These 4 gods came down from the heavens and defeated the Titans, which were massive creatures native to the One Piece planet, and became gods in the eyes of the mortals that lived there before them. Then they planted these massive trees that yielded incredibly powerful devil fruits, and one god stood against the rest. He was the sun god Nika, but his true role was actually the god of rebellion. And his devil fruit, the human fruit model sun god Nika, really only appears in grave times of great strife and need, when the One Piece world is in dire need of a real power change. And I also theorized that I could pinpoint the exact year that this all happened, thanks to these two calendars. So without further ado, I want to get into part 3 of the 4 ages mega theory, which is gonna be calendar piece. Yes, this entire video is gonna be about calendars, and you're about to be shocked at how awesome and fun this is gonna be, I think. Now, if you don't know, which I would assume most of you don't, unless you're maybe my fellow Oharan scholar Arthur, who runs the Library of Ohara here, the currently used calendar in the modern One Piece era is the so-called Kaindeki calendar. Now, this is the globally accepted calendar that the entire One Piece world uses, and it translates to the Sea Circle calendar. And I believe that I not only uncovered why it is called that, but also why it might spoil so much about the truth about One Piece. Here's what we do know about this weird Kaindeki calendar. It does mimic our world's Gregorian calendar, since it has 12 months, each with about 30 or 31 days, and a leap day every 4 years. And in case you're wondering, yes, there is actually a character whose birthday is on February the 29th, which is Panda Man, and by association also Panda Woman. Now, I hear you saying maybe, why does any of this matter? Why are we talking about calendars? Well, the days and months matching our world is obviously super convenient for marketing purposes, since, you know, we can then also celebrate our favorite Straw Hats' birthdays together, and Oda gives us a bunch of characters' birthday using exactly this system. But it's not only that, it also shares another thing in common with the Gregorian calendar too. They are both not the first calendars used in their respective worlds, just the most recent ones. You probably don't know this, but we actually learned about this other calendar all the way back during chapter 203 in Alabasta, as Robin first tells us about it when she's actually lying to Sir Crocodile about what is written on the poneglyph while she's deciphering it. Instead of telling him about Pluton and Joy Boy, she instead uses dates and times associated with this second calendar when she describes the following events. The conquest of Alabasta by Kahira. This is the heavenly calendar, year 239. Year 260, under the rule of the Vatan dynasty of Tamar. Then year 306, the Great Cathedral of Tuf is completed in Elmar. Year 325, Mundine, the hero of Ortea, does something. And to me, this is a serious proof that at some point during the ancient rule of Alabasta, the calendar actually shifts. And I think it's especially interesting to notice when these calendars do shift, which places this time period over 1,500 years ago. Now, Alabasta itself is one of, if not the oldest civilization that we do see in the One Piece world based on the information we've been given about it. And this point is actually what caused me to really deep dive into the why behind all of this. Like, why 2 calendars? Why did they change? And why bring it up to begin with? And in general, why is this important? Well, to start answering all of these questions, it's really important for me to tell you the name of this other much older calendar, because it is known as the Tendeki calendar, also known as the Sky calendar, but actually much more precisely translated as the heavenly calendar. Now, if you're a viewer who has been watching this mega theory from the beginning, you may just have had your ears poke up hearing exactly those names, and I wouldn't blame you, because for me it was actually this entire calendar naming scheme I stumbled across that set this entire 4 ages mega theory into motion to begin with. And again, you're probably wondering at this point why, like, what is going on? It's 2 calendars, big deal. Well, I did mention at the beginning of this video and throughout the mega theory so far that I believe that there was a massive war that took place way before the Void Century and the big war that happened then. Like, way before. Almost double the current gap between the current era of Luffy and the Void Century, in fact. A war that ended roughly 1,500 years ago. Based on evidence from the series, using real-world references, and Oda's clear inspiration as a reference as well, I came to the conclusion that the sun god Nika probably led a rebellion against the rain, forest, and earth gods at some point roughly 700 years before the Void Century, though I couldn't exactly place when in the timeline this happened until now, because thank God we have calendars in One Piece. And I actually realized that there are some oddly specific details in when the calendars exactly switched and very specific placements of years in the story, and all of these little details that Oda has hidden throughout have actually helped me pinpoint exactly when this epic battle of the gods took place. At least I'm like 99% sure. Like, obviously, you know, it's still a theory. You can never go to like 100, but I feel like we're cooking here. So, according to the current Sea Circle calendar, year 0 was 1,524 years ago in the One Piece story. Now, seeing as the Void Century was only about 900 years ago and then lasted for 100 years, this is a little bit confusing, because we know for a fact that at some point before this, the heavenly calendar was used as well. I mean, Nico Robin tells us as much. Not to mention that this is pretty much a given, since human civilization on the One Piece planet predates everything by like at least 3,500 years, seeing as Arubana itself is at least 5,000 years old. Now, I don't know about you, but I have one big question after seeing all that, which is, what happened at this point in time? Like, why not make the establishment of the world government year 0, for example? Well, probably because the world government didn't exist before the Void Century, because if they had been the people who created this calendar, they would most likely use this as a marker, right? But if there was some massive transition of power in the world, like a shift of, you know, who reigned the world, or a massive global event that makes this specific year significant, well, then we're actually in business, I think. And perhaps this is exactly this divide showcasing the shift from the era of the gods to the era of the mortals. As I mentioned, this may be the actual moment that Nika themselves rallied the world against the gods and used the ancient weapons to fight his fellow Lunarians. In fact, this may have even been what caused the great first flood in the One Piece world to occur and accidentally create a little something that we now know as the Grand Line. Okay, look at this model map, or I guess whatever it is behind me on the green screen, and tell me what you notice about the Grand Line here. It's like a big old stripe around the center of the world, right? Like, nothing too crazy. I've probably seen it like 100,000 times at this point, but you know what never really clicked until now? It's one big circle. And if you consider the ocean and its shape, you might even call it, like, I don't know, a sea circle? A circle of sea around the One Piece planet? Yeah, that's right. That may be the true origin of the name, the Sea Circle calendar. But wait, there is a lot more. I think that this little name gimmick with the calendars is exactly what reveals the true events prior to the Void Century. Because I may have nailed down why the Sea Circle calendar got its name, but to truly support my claim here, I need to match the Heavenly calendar up the same way, and well, I did find some pretty interesting stuff to do exactly that. Okay, let me set the scene here. seeing as Whitebeard referred to the Lunarians on top of the red line as the gods in heaven, the celestial dragons live in the Holy Land Merijoa on top of the red line, and that the fallen celestial dragon Doflamingo is named the heavenly demon, I would say it's pretty safe to associate the red line with all their gods on it with the word heaven in the One Piece series. And so I do believe that it's also pretty fair game to see that association and go, so the red line must have something to do then with that heavenly calendar. See where I'm going with this? So now we do have a bit of a working idea of why these calendars got their initial names, but then the next big question immediately that we want to ask is, why did they switch calendars at all to begin with? Because remember that this heavenly calendar was used far, far before the world government ever came into power and the celestial dragons even took their place on top of the red line. Which to me leaves only one answer, at least as far as I can see it, being that this heavenly calendar must have been directly tied to the rule of the Lunarians instead. Which really shouldn't be all of that surprising, since I've spent like 2 whole theory videos now talking about how thousands of years ago there's a lot of proof that the Lunarians most likely came down from space, from the moon, the heavens on the moon, to the blue planet below. And while we don't know exactly what caused the Lunarians to lose their spot upon the red line throughout the One Piece story, at this point, 1,500 years ago, that very well should have been right there. So now that we have the Lunarians possibly connected to this calendar shift, what massive event in the One Piece world could they have been involved in that warrants something like a complete change in calendar and dating? And now don't worry, since I just made a whole video about it, I'll spare you the theatrics and the roundarounds. I believe that the Lunarians fell at the hands of the Ancient Kingdom, and that the Ancient Kingdom was actually the initial alliance that Nika raised against the original gods. So that of course begs the question, why do I think that this is what happens? Well, let's just start by saying that I have reasons to believe that since the original inhabitants of the Red Lines were the Lunarians, we pretty much know that, and that they are connected to the other sky races based on their design, they also may have been a group that worshipped Nika himself. Plus, we do know that races that worship Sun God Nika, like the Buccaneers or the Tontada, ended up in slavery and persecuted, and that the Lunarians were as well, so this points to them also potentially being worshippers of Nika. But regardless of just that though, something that we do know for certain is that these dark-winged angel-type creatures were at some point kicked off their high horse on top of the red line, and that it's pretty safe to say that someone with truly immense power or advanced technology would have only been able to do that. Because seriously, based on what we see with the Seraphim and during Wano with King, defeating just one Lunarian is really, really hard work. And now, of course, I don't know how many Lunarians actually were existing that were just hanging around back then, but if they were viewed as powerful gods, all of them at some point, according to Whitebeard at least, they would have been incredibly difficult to defeat, especially if Nika and the other farming gods were Lunarians, like I've proposed in my last theory. And to me, this makes it pretty clear that the people of the world, and more specifically the non-sky races of the world, needed a power boost to be able to take on the Lunarians. Now, why they had to do this is still pretty much a mystery even to me at this point, but there are of course a couple of good potential reasons that I could think of. Like that the gods enslaved parts of the world and Nika didn't like seeing people as slaves. In fact, we do know that there was one massive era of slavery that we learned about in chapter 726 when the Tontada chief Gancho revealed that the Tontada were enslaved by the Don Quixote in the Kingdom Dressrosa, and based on the timeline, this actually took place right before the Void Century. So maybe something like this, like an era of slavery, had something to do with it. But I actually do think it's much more likely that this act of slavery took place after the First Great War and is what led to the Second Great War that actually happened during the Void Century. So instead, I actually think that it might be much more likely that Nika did something that caused him to get exiled by the other gods, and in a fit of rebellion, he took the world down with him to eventually free himself from their divine punishment. And this would actually line up pretty nicely with a lot of the mythological inspirations like Kaguya-hime. Sun Wukong, or even Lucifer, all of them fallen gods who retaliated against the gods after their own crimes. Now, without going into all of the detail I went into with my Nika video and Bible piece here, there are just tons and tons of mythological stories that Oda-sensei seems to have taken inspiration from when making his godlike characters in One Piece as well. Prometheus, Zeus, the Titans. I have talked about all of them recently and how their acts of rebellion against the established gods seem to all line up with Nika and then Joy Boy and then Luffy, whose true title might have actually been the God of Rebellion. In fact, I think that this would line up way better with the Warrior of Liberation theme than his actual Sun God title would do anyways. But speaking of rebellion and all these big wars, I should also come clean with you guys and tell you that I've been keeping a pretty big secret from you all. I actually have come up with not one, but two possible timelines that I have uncovered today. You see, once I had actually laid out all the information we just talked about on paper and then had talked to friends and my team about it, and they're actually rooted in two very different sets of evidence with two very different pieces of arguments that surprisingly somehow end up at the very same conclusion. So let's talk about what course of events might have happened in timeline number one for how this calendar switch happened and why, and then after, we'll talk about option number two. And I should probably also quickly preface this by saying, even though I mentioned it at the top of the video, if you haven't watched my theories on the Age of Titans and the Age of Nika, the storyline I'm about to talk about will sound a little bit wacky and crazy, so please make sure to catch up on them at least after, you watch this video to truly understand the depth of this theory, because again, stuff of like, if you just hear it for the first time, it'll just sound a little bit wild, which not saying it's not, but there is evidence for a lot of this. So, to just make this as simple as I can possibly make it, I've named my two possible timelines different ways. Option one is the Heavenly War Calendar timeline, and the second option is the Void Century War timeline. And as you can probably guess, the key difference is when I think during the timeline the calendar switch actually happened, which is either the moment that the War of Heaven and Earth ended, or maybe even during the Void Century itself. And the first option kind of revolves around when Nika the Lunarian and his comrades, the Rain, Forest, and Earth gods, came down 5,000 years ago from the moon, which we can basically conclude based on the fact that Alabasta's castle, Arubana, was built over 5,000 years ago as well. And in this timeline, the gods came down and brought civilization and agriculture to the One Piece world, and at that point, the people of that era adopted their heavenly calendar from the moon. They then used this Tendeki heavenly calendar for thousands of years until the Great War of Heaven and Earth happened, the battle between the gods, the Lunarians, and Nika, and the races that allied with him. Now, I have theorized that this is when Nika actually lost and died, and his powers were then infused into a devil fruit that then helped lead the ancient kingdom to their eventual victory 1,524 years ago. Now, this specific year is the moment that the calendars do seem to switch according to extrapolated dates from the Nolan flashback, actually. And I believe that during this year, the world flooded for the very first time because the ancient weapons had been used too much or were used as weapons. And this is what led the ancient kingdom, the group of people and kingdoms that worship Nika, to form their empire in a strip of land opposite to the Red Line, in other words, opposite to the Lunarians and the other gods. And this other circle of ocean, where many kingdoms in their alliance found new homes, then became known as the Grand Line, which is the Great Sea Circle. And then as a result, the group that formed the ancient kingdom called and named their new calendar after exactly that, where they lived and the new kingdom that they had established. And yes, what I'm basically saying here is that the Grand Line is the ancient kingdom, just that during the Void Century there was probably a lot more land to it. And after that, the story then pretty much goes the way that we know it. Years later, Joy Boy hits the scene, then at some point the world floods a second time, which I actually believe might have been Joy Boy's doing according to Bing Sake, and then he helps spread some poneglyphs around the rest of the world that we're deciphering right now. And after all of this happens, Emu rises then to power, erases the true history, causing what we now know, or I guess don't know, which is the Void Century. Now, this first idea, you can probably tell, focuses very much on the naming scheme and the fact that this 1,524 year ago moment was insanely crucial and the calendar switched immediately. Again, seeing as the heavenly calendar is probably named after the Lunarians and their initial rule over the One Piece world, the best reason to switch calendars is, well, when the Lunarians are just no longer in power, when power gets transferred from one age to the next. But no worries, I can hear you saying, what do you mean they lost power? All that we really know about the Lunarians is that they had been prosecuted by the Celestial Dragons and driven to near extinction at some point. And all of that is of course true, but we also know that at some point the Lunarians were thought throughout the One Piece world of as gods, and that is the main driving reason I believe that Nika and the other gods were also Lunarians. They probably weren't actual gods, but more so people with incredible power and technology, and that is something that often leads to rebellion. It's about as common as it gets in the real world, and there is evidence in the One Piece series to point at a similar cycle of violence and oppression in the One Piece world as well that has basically been repeating over the last few thousand years. And let's just say at this point that there is a lot to be said about how Oda frames groups in the series, and how the persecuted groups in One Piece often only become persecuted after they themselves fell from power and were enslaved by those who persecuted them to begin with. Something that, as you can guess, I will talk a lot about when we get to the modern current Luffy era in this 4H model as well. Okay, but for now let's operate with the idea that I've been running with, which is that the Lunarians were defeated 1,524 years ago at the hands of what then became the Ancient Kingdom, which I then believe makes a lot of sense for that to be the moment when the calendars first switch and they kicked it off at basically year 0 of the liberated world with that new calendar. And while I do have to admit that this is the actual idea I personally like the most and subscribe to, since it's just a little bit more clear-cut and simple, I wouldn't of course be a good One Piece YouTuber if I didn't at least cover the evidence for the other possible option and explain that as well. So, in option 2, which is the Void Century War Calendar option, the idea for that one is that 1,524 years ago, the Great War of Heaven and Earth took place. This, by the way, is just my little fun nickname for the battle that I think took place between the Ancient Kingdom, with Nika battling against the Lunarians and the other 3 gods of Rain, Earth, and Forest. So, everything generally lines up pretty much the same initially, but in this version, the Ancient Kingdom continues to use the heavenly calendar until the Void Century happens. And then it's not until after the Void Century takes place and the Ancient Kingdom is actually overthrown by the 20 other kingdoms that then formed the world government that they then decide to switch the calendar, choosing to line up year 0 as the moment that the Ancient Kingdom was formed by Nika, because it is very likely that the 20 kingdoms were actually part of the Ancient Kingdom that they themselves kind of rebelled against this greater collective. Now, the evidence for all of this lies actually in the connection between the Sea Circle calendar and the real-world Gregorian calendar. You see, in our real world, calendars do switch when new world powers come into play as well. And in our real world, the moment that the Western world switched to the now current Gregorian calendar was actually when the Christian Church took over the strongest empire, Rome, thus shifting from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar so that the farmers could properly track when their crops would be ready to harvest. Now, funnily enough, evidence for this is even somewhat conflicting with historians in our real world, but it does seem like a good reason behind it was that there was some mathematical errors with the original calendar that ended up slowly shifting off cycle, kind of drifting off, so that the Gregorian calendar then was designed to accommodate for, precession and all these things with leap years and gap years, and so on and so forth. Anyhow, the idea here is that in One Piece, the equivalent to the Christian Church taking over Rome was when the 20 kingdoms overthrew the Great Kingdom or rebelled against it. And I do actually think that this parallel works for a ton of different reasons and has its roots in all of the different ideas that I've talked about in Bible Peace and the Nika era theory as well. There are several allusions to Christianity snuffing out older religions, as can be seen by the Holy Land Marijua and its very Christian themes. For example, the world government actively takes Joy Boy and the races that worship Nika and the other gods out of the picture. Buccaneers, they all get murdered. Lunarians, rest in peace, the other gods, and the giants, well, dang, the world government's been trying to kill those guys for centuries now. And most obvious of all is, of course, the Fishman race, the group that they give an ounce of power to, but then keep them tied down worse than all of the other races combined. And so, considering that they've already gone out of their way to wipe out everyone that's connected to the old gods, it would make a lot of sense that they were the actual group that then also flips the calendars to kind of try and distort history. But instead of starting year 0 at the Void Century, since there were and are still many kingdoms not in the 20 Kingdom Alliance, it might have made the most sense to actually predate Year Zero to the most important event at that time, which was the fall of Nika, but also of the Lunarians. And that way it wouldn't just throw everything into whack right away. And this once again has some parallels to our real world, seeing as the Julian calendar's year number 1 was in 45 BC when the calendar was then implemented, but then when they switched over to the Gregorian calendar, they retrofitted year 1 to the birth of Christ instead of the Julian calendar's original year number 1. Now again, just to look at this from all sides, the biggest point against this idea, I guess, is that it would make more sense to have the modern calendar named the Heavenly Calendar to begin with, since it now focuses on the celestial dragons in the Holy Land and not really on that empire of the Sea Circle. But the counterpoint there, I guess, is that the moment for year 0 is still when the Grand Line was formed, just that it didn't change right away, and you know that the 20 kingdoms that then went up to the Red Line were originally based on the Grand Line. But regardless of the timeline options here, they both also pull a lot on the idea that calendar switches somehow have to do with farming. And the real world evidence here is the fact that the Gregorian calendar was actually chosen to correct a shift in the seasonal equinoxes, which is when the sun is at its highest or lowest points, thus making it easier to schedule farming and sowing crops. And seeing as the core theory around the gods that we previously talked about is them coming down from the moon and bringing the world farming and civilization, it does make a lot of sense, I think, to keep the heavenly calendar longer around as to not screw up the current world agricultural system. But then it also makes sense to switch it when the world government comes into play and literally restructures the entire world, also physically, focusing on their farming needs in the Holy Land and not really caring for the world altogether anyways. Okay, so up to this point, this pretty much nicely covers calendar piece, a new theory that will definitely enter my personal Hall of Fame alongside with Bible and whale piece, but I still haven't answered one massive important question from the very first mega theory video we did here. What does this all actually mean for the modern era and our main character, Monkey D. Luffy? Like, yeah, I've made some cool discoveries here about the past and what may have happened in agriculture, blah, 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 but how does all of this even, like, impact the story? How does it shape the world now and the story of Luffy and the Straw Hat specifically? And well, for that, we actually gotta talk about one of my favorite things in the world, global politics, because it might actually hold the secret to Nika's will, an endless cycle of chaos in the One Piece world, and it could also answer Rayleigh's big question from chapter 507 and even show us what will need to happen before the ending of the series. But since there is so much to cover here, I do think it makes the most sense to cover all of it in one big fat mega theory video. But I will also say that all this talk of an endless cycle of violence also is a driving point of my Joy Boys 1000 year plan theory, which ties into all of what I've been talking about right now and the complete mega theory coming up. So if you want to uncover why Shanks had the Nika fruit, what Roger's plan was, and how this all even connects to Luffy, give that video a watch first by clicking right below me, and get ready because next time, anarchy reigns. Alright, Shanks, so much for watching. I hope this is starting to come together. It'll make a lot more sense in the big final theory video that we're cooking up. But in the meantime, thanks to my Patreons if you want to support the channel, because, I mean, these guys are really what, you know, help us even do what we do. So if you want to support the channel too, want to get some extra cool perks like bonus content, early access stuff, and whatnot, art assets, go check it out. And I will see you in this next one. Go click on it. I mean, yeah, it's right there. Yeah, why are you still here?